And we're back with Eric Norrie. Welcome back, Eric.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, so I made sure to listen to our previous podcast episode that we did together just to prepare for this and try and pick up sort of where we left off. We were getting into the topic of immigration, and I know you wanted to go more into that. I know you mentioned that you wanted to explore particularly immigration as it concerns open borders. Could you go ahead and delve into that? Let me know what exactly it is you're thinking there.
Sure. For me, I think it's important to examine the role that borders play and figure out if they're actually doing their job, optimally or close to optimally, and if not, then how can we change that? So we sort of think of borders as these things that have always existed, in the exact form that they are now, when the truth is kind of anything but. They largely sort of arose after the Treaty of Westphalia in, I think, 1647. And that the Peace of Westphalia, or the Treaty of Westphalia, kind of created sort of like two really important things happened right after that. The creation of the modern nation state, and also sort of the beginnings of the real idea of separation between religion and state in Europe. It was sort of the end of all of these religious wars, and there would still be plenty of wars to come after that, but they said, hey, we're going to stop doing the religious wars. And I feel like that second one actually was more important in a lot of ways, and actually had a larger effect. But then we kind of, we saw a correlation between, the creation of the state and at least a little bit more peaceful, even though it's hard to imagine. And then, and World War, the World Wars notwithstanding, which I guess is a pretty big asterisk, but I would say that there's, religion, and so I'm getting off.
Right. I get what you're saying here. So the Peace of Westphalia, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is seen as one of the seminal moments in history, at least as political scientists are concerned with matters of political science, because the foundation of most geopolitics can be found in the Peace of Westphalia. And for the reasons you stated, it established what you described as the modern notion of the nation state. I think I would elaborate a little further, and probably most political scientists would as well, is that it established...
Please do, actually.
Yeah, it established the idea of sovereignty. So
yeah,
the idea of the nation state sort of coincided with that in many ways, and in some ways it sort of preceded it. So you sort of see that with certain medieval developments, like in the 100 Years' War, the idea of a French kingdom built around a French people. And this is why Joan of Arc is a major figure in French history, because she helped the French rally against the English under the idea of Frenchness, particularly at a time when not all of what we consider France today had been controlled by the English. If you're familiar with the term historians use called the Angevin Empire, the English actually controlled about half of France at certain points in the Middle Ages. They were technically under the overlordship of the French king, but when you're, say, Duke of Normandy, but also King of England, how much do you care about the overlordship of the French king, right? So that was a factor, and that sort of led up into something like the Peace of Westphalia. But you also, I think, really correctly noted the idea of separating religious governance from secular governance. But I think really it speaks generally to the issue that comes with sovereignty, which is of governance, and who gets to decide what within what borders. And that's one of the functions of borders. as I would understand. It's basically saying when a certain entity has certain laws declared, where do those laws apply? And borders give you an idea of that. I think the second function of borders is a bit more straightforward, which is that of defense. So, you might want to control a certain ridge of hills and mountains or rivers so that you have a more easily defensible territory. So an example would be when Israel seized the Golan Heights from Syria in the Six-Day War in 1967, I believe it was. Or maybe that was the Yom Kippur War, but in one of those wars, it seized those because those gave it a more defensible position in the event of an attack by the Syrians again in another war, which it has used for that purpose. That's another purpose of borders. And is that sort of the idea that the dual idea that you have right there, that borders basically provide the purpose of explaining where laws are in force and then giving a frontier of defense from outside aggressors?
Yeah, and I think it is really important to delineate those two because there's nothing. I think you nailed it with that, actually, by the way. There's nothing really about the area of sovereignty that in and of itself says, and by the way, nobody can enter or like that it actually says anything about the people that can enter the area of sovereignty, aside from the like there's nothing within that a border in and of itself says about who can cross it, like that borders as a concept that is say, even though we think of them as very hard line things. Canada begins here, US begins here, Mexico begins here, but even that has really that they've even that's arisen again largely since the Peace of Westphalia. Before that, the anthropologist Ben Anderson has a really good kind of take on this, or at least like, anthropologist and historian. I think he's kind of got a bit of a dual role there. He saw the world as largely constructed of metropoles, so everyone kind of circulated around their like the main kind of common hub, but so that's the one thing, is the area of sovereignty, and then the second thing is the defense thing. And then we've also seen, especially in the 20th century, that the role of defense can largely be played by allied territories, working as if in some ways as if those borders were like there were a lot of you can make a lot of exceptions during wartime for your allies being able to get to the front. So that's another point to consider there. I guess fundamentally, the point for me that always sticks out is that it doesn't make sense in my mind that we, most people would never discriminate based on the color of people's skin. Like I'm sure there's plenty that would disagree with that, but at least we would acknowledge that we shouldn't discriminate based on the color of people's skin. Yet we don't really see much of a problem with discriminating based on where someone is born, which is essentially what we do when we say that, like, well, borders might not be perfect, but they're here and that's the end of it. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. So yeah, I guess we can start from that philosophical point, perhaps. Why would you, like, what do you think of that idea? Do you think I'm kind of oversimplifying there when I say, like, it doesn't make sense that we... Go ahead.
I suppose that in some ways there's sort of an overlap between discriminating against color of skin and discriminating against someone based on where they're born, because to a significant degree, where you're born will be indicative of the color of your skin. So if you're born in Europe, there's a pretty good guess about the color of your skin. If you're born in Africa, it's a pretty good guess about the color of your skin. If you're born in China, it's a pretty good guess about the color of your skin or your racial attributes. And so while that's not an absolute system, I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien was born in Africa, so doesn't necessarily predict well for him, but there's a lot of that going on. And when you look at, say, if we go to the salient example with Mexico and the United States and the border policy between the two, you're looking at Latin people trying to come into the United States from Mexico, and you have America, which is a majority European nation. Even if you count even if you count only the non-Hispanic or non-Latin whites, because some people can be considered both, you have an easy 61% majority of whites in the United States. And you have that country showing a lot of resistance and hesitance about letting in people from south of its border along, where Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California are. You have that group being hesitant to let in people from countries where their appearance is not like that. Their appearance is largely just sort of based on the people who naturally live in the region. It's but mostly descendants of the Spanish, and then of course the indigenous population, and a lot of the hesitance there could be seen as somewhat racially motivated, because they're people who don't look like the white people of America, and there are some cultural differences, the language being one of the big ones for many people. And so to that end, you could see how, if you're against discriminating against someone based on the color of their skin, but then you do it by the place of their birth, you're 90% of the time doing the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So there is that. That's not an irrelevant point. I do think, however, when we get to the issue of sovereignty, one thing is different about that is when we normally talk about discriminating against someone, right, whether it's based on the color of their skin or something else, and the problems that come with discrimination, we're usually talking about something at a more interpersonal level, right? So refusing to hire a specific person who applied for a job, or refusing to serve a specific person who entered your place of business, and doing this based on something like their race or their sex or their sexual orientation or their religious beliefs. Those are usually more, that's like based on what a person does to another person. With borders, it's interesting. It's a nation deciding for itself, essentially, through whatever legal and political processes it makes those decisions, what's allowed on its territory. And you can refuse entry to people from outside as a matter of, say, security. And so there's a good argument for that, right? There's not a good argument for saying, well, I'm not going to hire you because you're black, and therefore that makes me unsafe, right? So it's pretty obvious right there why such discrimination would be bad. But
well, I would say I think you touched on it, but I'm not sure it's actually as obvious as you sort of imply there, because the difference would be whether you said we don't allow black people in these borders, rather than that would be more akin to say we don't hire black people, because there was sort of a difference in both degree and kind that you made there. And I'm saying that we should try to look at, I think it would make more sense if we could look at something where it's only a difference in degree, borders being a much bigger scale, level of being able to say things. Because you're right, that borders, there often is overlap between racial discrimination and borders. The question is, should there be? And like, so I think that we're getting, actually, yeah, you got to the point that borders serve at the end there, which is security. But the question is are they doing it optimally? And how can, what exactly do we mean when we say that borders help security?
All right, so I think one thing we're saying is that, well, effectively, for borders to mean anything, right? For the first component, where it's the defined territory where a polity's laws apply, for that to be true, you need a certain amount of safety so that people don't come in and just basically ignore your laws. So when there were different kingdoms and states of varying kinds in Asia with their laws, those laws quickly didn't mean anything when the Mongols came in during the Middle Ages. So, there's that aspect. And so, something like women's rights sort of relies on the assumption that, say, an organized group like ISIS can't come in and start doing terrible things to women like it does in the territories it controls. I doubt something like that would be particularly likely through an open border with Mexico, but it sort of hints at what we're trying to prevent in principle. And even if we wouldn't ever experience something as extremely negative as that, we wouldn't want anything going in that direction if we can help it, because our ability to live in a society of law and order does imply that we're able to maintain control over the territory where we wish those laws to apply. And to that end, we do need to control our borders. And so the fundamental problem or conundrum, as I see it, is this: we don't want to discriminate against people based on their race, which means that to a large extent, we don't want to discriminate against people based on the place of their birth, given how those two are largely linked. At the same time, however, in the interests of security, which means we must have some strategy for keeping people out, or at least controlling how they come in, we cannot help the fact that people live where they live and are born where they're born and are where they are. We cannot help the fact that Mexicans are in Mexico. We cannot help the fact that the Chinese are in China and the Japanese are in Japan. And we cannot help what that means about their ability to enter our country. I mean, some of it is just a natural problem presented by the geography of the planet as it developed. And if it had developed in a different way, we would have completely different border issues at this moment. If we had a sort of Pangea type Earth still, maybe there wouldn't be all of this same stuff about borders. It'd be interesting to imagine if there would have been less balkanization and isolation of human populations from such a possible development, and how that might have affected our abilities of integration as a species.
I think,
yeah. So that's the conundrum I see: is we do have material interests in security, and these security interests have not died with modernization. Like, if we think of something as seemingly obsolete as the threat of the Mongols coming in and basically saying, well, your laws don't apply anymore, that's not totally out of the picture, even for a country like the United States, certainly not for smaller and weaker countries on this planet. And as long as that's the state of geopolitics, that's our conundrum, because we need to do something to have reasonable borders, whatever country we are, whether it's the United States or Canada or Mexico or Iraq or Syria. And we need to be able to figure that out first before we can look at greater efforts of human integration, if human integration is understood to be a solution to how we might discriminate against people about where they're allowed to go in the world.
right. So first, a point of clarification. You touched on a lot of things there, which I'd like to get to. First, a point of clarification. Today, I'm mostly talking about borders, in general, and not specific borders necessarily. Although I'm actually happy to talk about specific borders. But what I'm hoping to do in this conversation is I'm not trying to, say, oh, we should immediately, snap our fingers and open borders up everywhere, and all will be hunky dory. My question is whether our societies are moving, in the correct direction as far as border, the role borders play, to optimize human wellness. A second point that you said, so that's just a first little disclaimer. But so you implied that it was borders that that enforce. It seemed like you implied that that it was borders that enforce laws within its territory, when it's the police and the justice system and law enforcement, and also and actually, and then we'll get to this in a little bit, and cultural practices within the borders that actually that actually perform that role. If so, like.
Yeah, so yeah, I see what you're saying there. So I would say that borders are a tool of security agents like police or like the military to create the state of security for its people. So, borders don't actually do it themselves, but borders give us basically a starting point for where we want to go with things. Like, so, did this happen on this side of the line or on that side of the line? If it happened on this side of the line, then the police can do something about it, right? We can work with that. If it happened on that side of the line, then we can't. And then the military is like, well, did they cross this line or not? If they cross this line, then we can do something about it, right? So it gives sort of a practical field of vision to our security agents as a polity, whatever country you're talking about. So I think it's a tool insofar as that it's not the primary force that drives security. You're right that it's human beings who do that, but I think borders are a very useful and critical tool for human beings in this process.
I actually agree with that. That's the point that I'm eventually getting here, is that the role that they play, or at least that, is as a tool to separate, and it's sort of two things. It's to help separate, sort of based on culture, even though we don't like to admit it. But I think that it's, in terms of the security argument for it, I think it's important to acknowledge that. And then based on economics. So for example, has the Canadian-U.S. border, has the same rules applied to it throughout the entirety of your lifetime, for example?
I don't know what the rules for the U.S.-Canada border have been, especially throughout my lifetime, and how they might have changed. I assume they haven't always been consistent, and that's only because about a third of the way through my life, 9/11 happened. So I imagine that changed border policy generally for the United States, whether it was U.S.-Mexico, U.S.-Canada, port things, stuff on the Pacific Islands we owned. Imagine that played a role and probably changed things. Although I do know that throughout history, the U.S.-Canada border situation has been pretty unique, particularly when you look at what happened with the Oregon Territory, where it was jointly occupied by the United States and the United Kingdom before the border was defined where it is now. That is actually a pretty interesting situation, if you ask me, that we had going on, even though that wouldn't have involved a lot of people out at the time, except for the indigenous populations. But for the most part, I don't really know. I guess there's maybe an observation you're going to make about U.S.-Canadian border policy?
So yeah, at some point along the way here, and I'll get to the point here in a bit. The Canadians needed passports to enter the U.S. and they didn't before. Do you know, like, if you took, you know, a range of 5 years, when would you guess that that happened?
I would say that probably happened between 1996 and 2001.
Yeah, see, that would make sense, but it happened, you know, in 2009. You know, we're at that point we're well away from 9/11, and you're right, 9/11 did change things as far as security goes, and I think certainly some of which was necessary, and then some of which is, you know, I think, you know, arguably less so. Not, you know, which fair enough. It makes sense to be, you know, as precautious as one can be in situations like that. But we often do kind of point to 9/11 as, you know, like, well, you know, it sucks that we need to do blank, but 9/11, you know, is the reason why we need to do it. And yeah, I think oftentimes it's sort of an excuse. My bigger point too, just between, like, by looking at the Canadian border, is saying that, well, the Canadian border is also not the same as the U.S.-Mexico border, and there's legitimate reasons for that. But I think we need to be specific about what those reasons are, so that we can maximize the effectiveness of the tools in terms of the, you know, the border of performing those functions, and minimize it for other functions. Does that make sense?
Yes, and so it seems to me like what we need to observe why the U.S. had a soft border with Canada, why it hasn't had one with
Yes.
Mexico, and what the critical reasons were for that. Now, I think I can opine about what those might be.
Yeah.
So
Go for it.
I think
You're the American here, so you actually would have a better, you know, ability to compare the two borders than I would.
Right. So I think there's the obvious one that would stand out to most people, which is you don't have a lot of Canadians hurrying to get into the U.S. like you do Mexicans, nor do you have a lot of Americans hurrying to get into Canada. So just in terms of what our own native populations are feeling, there's not a whole lot of friction there on that front. So that's one thing. I think another thing is Canada is probably better able to control a lot of the borders that it has with, well, not just with the U.S., right? It also doesn't border other countries, as far as I can tell, except for maybe Greenland. And so there's less of an issue where someone could get into Canada and then get into America through a soft border with the U.S. And then there's also what you said, where the passport was not needed for Canadians, but if you're a non-Canadian trying to immigrate to America from Canada, that might not be true for you. And so, but I think some of it rests on the idea that because Canada has perhaps better control of its own borders than Mexico does of its own borders, and it's a stabler country than Mexico, it's a lot easier to look at Canadian borders as an extension of the U.S. borders, and to allow more intercourse between the two countries, where it provides benefits and eliminates needless costs. With Mexico, right, there's not so much stability with its native population. There are people who are trying to come here. Now, in recent years, there's actually been a net decline in illegal immigrants coming from Latin America through the U.S.-Mexico border, which is why the wall would be a bad idea, because you kind of be erecting a barrier to keep people from going back. Many people have been going back to Mexico because immigration here is not as lucrative as it used to be. And a lot of that's just a result of post-2008 United States. But then there are also other concerns, right? So Mexico is largely run by drug cartels, and if we had, let's say, a completely open border, they would have no qualms about crossing into Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and causing havoc. To some extent, things like that occur, but it would lower the cost of entry for such actions. And then, not just the drug cartels, but then there's the issue of human trafficking across the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, I feel like making the borders more porous between U.S. and Mexico would increase the threat of that in a way that's just not true of the U.S.-Canada border, given what is going on in the U.S. and Canada. And so I think these are some of the considerations we have in mind when we talk about how hard we want the border to be with Mexico versus how soft we want it to be with Canada. There's just differing realities about the two countries, and so it makes it difficult for the U.S. to be as consistent. And this can be problematic in a sense, because going back to the issue of how we discriminate against people, Canada, much like the United States, is a largely Caucasian population nation, due to the fact that it's a similar colonial country formed by British and French settlers, particularly after plagues and disease killed most of the indigenous populations. So it has that similarity where, on the face of it, the U.S. is allowing easier border entry to a population to its north that is culturally and linguistically, historically more similar to it, and therefore racially more similar to it, and it's making it harder for entry for a country that is culturally and historically and linguistically and therefore racially less similar to it. And so that's sort of a problem on the face, where you get into some of these racial undertones, and you have to wonder whether intentionally or at least implicitly that's what's at work.
Well, I think the reason why the conversation often ends up going that way is because we use a lot of different things as proxies for culture, and I used to do that all the time. But increasingly, I'm seeing that that's just not really sustainable, and it ends up doing more harm than good, because it's a lot easier to say, well, we shouldn't be racist, than it is to say, well, maybe some cultures, overall, or at least some aspects of some cultures result in more prosperity for the people or freedom, and usually both, for the people living within them than others. And so instead of culture, we use proxies for culture, such as race or geography or linguistics. But that last one, we use all three of those to varying degrees in different places. And my point is that I think that by kicking the can down the road, we're not doing ourselves any favors. I think that we should actually, look at what it is about, cultures that we appreciate and ones that we don't. And I think that America actually does a really good job of this, which a few years ago I would have never seen myself saying. But there are practical reasons why the Canadian model of a cultural mosaic, doesn't work. Most of you can point at at things in Quebec all day long, actually. Well, just in terms of why do you privilege the one group? It's like, oh, because they were here first. Like, well, right, but they weren't. It was the indigenous people, and it was it's like, well, because might makes right, what it ends up coming down to. Because we say that we're a cultural mosaic, but really that seems to be a way to just kind of placate the relationship between Anglo Canada and Franco Canada, and but although that's like historically, I think that's largely what it was. It was our current premier's father, Pierre Trudeau, who really pushed for multiculturalism, and and he did so while stopping, while being a major part of the reason why Quebec didn't separate from Canada. And so I think that a large part of the reasoning there was, if we say that all cultures are equal, then that will actually help the equality between, French Canada and English Canada, which is not a bad. It's not a bad thing. I just don't think it's optimal. I think that the U.S. system ends up being more optimal, even though I feel like there's theoretical problems with the melting pot model. But what the golden ingredient seems to be is the individuality that that seems to be a major part of American culture, where in more collectivistic cultures, you could arguably, I think, call China a melting pot model, in that you sort of need to blend in with the rest of it, but it becomes a bit of a sludge in the way that American culture does not, because despite what what a lot of people claim, it seems like Americans actually, by and large, do respect the sovereignty of each other as individuals, to have their own practices and stuff. And so I think that the American model is actually pretty close to what I would like. I just would like I would like a bit more recognition that of the role that individuality plays in it, I think.
Oh yeah, this seems to be hearkening to what I discussed in the last episode of the podcast. It's been a now. Yeah, but yeah, with Mike, and it's I think that's actually it's maybe pertinent to look at this when we talk about the issue of borders, what their purpose is, and what kind of border situation we should be seeking in the future, because the question of the how open or shut borders are really gets to the issue of, well, is a nation trying to be a cultural mosaic or a melting pot? And I think
we need to hammer that down, I think.
All right, so I think when you look at the U.S., when its borders were some of its most open, when there was from the late 19th to early 20th century, and there were floods of immigrants from Europe coming in, you had that coming in, and there was the idea of people would come in and they would melt into the pot and become American. And so you have a lot of people who they'll tell you their background is Italian or French Cajun or German or something. I mean, there are people who will talk about that, but it doesn't really stand out about them. Not a whole lot. And I would say the only group that you'd consider white that really stands out as having its own distinct culture, in the way it is anywhere in the U.S., is with the Jewish population. They sort of seem, and I think that's just sort of given how the Jews operated even when they were in Europe, right? But all right, so you took the Jews out of we'll say Israel and put them in Europe, and they did that thing, and then taking them out of Europe and putting them in America, I mean, they're just going to do what they keep doing. So it doesn't surprise me too much that Jewish Americans kind of have their own culture and their own sort of inner circle in the way they live compared to other races or ethnic groups, depending on how you want to define these things. Whereas, you take the Italians out of Italy, what are they going to do, right? You take the Germans out of Germany, what are they going to do? And it seems to me like in that situation, they all sort of melded and conformed into a general Americanness. So as far as, and I mentioned this in the last episode, as far as white people are concerned, the melting pot has been pretty successful, and where there was a lot of strife among the different ethnic groups of Europe based around the idea of nation states. There hasn't been that and then that's what caused the two world wars. There has not been that in the United States, not to any significant degree. And the idea that it could happen now, that a certain group of white Americans would be somehow excluded from anything that is good about America is not conceivable. Again, the one exception might be Jewish Americans, given anti-Semitism and given that they just sort of seem to be the outlier. But the general trend, all other groups considered, is in the opposite. Now, when you go outside of white people, the melting pot is perhaps less as thorough, but I would still say it's occurring to degrees. It's probably occurred the most successfully with the Asian American population in terms of their ability to integrate and just, for them to feel American and for it to be mutual. I feel like we've had a harder time making Black Americans and Hispanic Americans feel the same. And some of that owes to things like the history of slavery or the border and cultural issues that have that we're seeing right now between, say, the U.S. and Mexico, and that sort of lead to the current discussions on things like a wall and whether to have open borders or not. I do think this is sort of something we need to talk about. I think a melting pot situation does ultimately make it easier in the long run if you have a kind of open border situation. But I think the thing there is you do need to make sure that the people who come in will melt. So how much is that going to occur? There are some cultures where you could send them to any country, not just the United States. They're probably not going to melt very well. And so they generally might have an issue. So, you take anyone who believes in a Sharia version of Islam. There are several millions of such people. They're going to have a hard time integrating into a society that does not already have or strive to have such a system. Whereas that's not necessarily as true of cultures that are themselves maybe less authoritarian in what they seek of others. So as far as I can tell, Polynesian people would probably not have trouble integrating in other parts of the world. Just because I can't think of a single thing. Again, I'm not well-versed or educated in their culture and their history and their philosophy, but I would be hard-pressed to think of anything where you'd have to worry about what Polynesian culture would do if it gained traction and then had the authority of the state behind it, like you would with a Sharia vision of Islam.
Yeah, I think that your point about Sharia kind of brings us back to sovereignty. I think what the difference between saying wanting to celebrate a holiday and saying that and trying to change something, especially something as fundamental as the separation between religion and state. Like I've talked to quite a few Arabic people. Mind you, I do definitely, there's a major sampling bias. It makes sense that people would, the Arabic immigrants to Canada, and refugees would think that way, and that's actually, well, that's not even all my population, though. I've also talked to like Egyptians in Egypt and stuff, and that, for example, that's why they kind of had that that military coup after the original revolution in Egypt, was because the was it Mohammed? Yeah, was Mohammed Morsi?
That sounds right.
Yeah, he was replaced by basically they had the original kind of dictator there who was a little bit of a Western puppet, but anyway, so they had to get him out because he wasn't really doing anything for the people. He was replaced by a major proponent of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Egyptians said, "No, we don't want this. Get the military in there, get the Muslim Brotherhood out, because even though a military dictatorship is not ideal, but it's going to be better than than continuing to do this thing that we've seen is not working out." And largely that's it's a pretty big component of the Arabic Spring, I would say. The Arab Spring was largely, ideas are shifting in the Arab world about whether we should have, Sharia law. And then Sharia law is kind of incompatible with our, judicial systems and actually kind of at odds with multiple parts of our cultures, including the separation of religion and state, as we talked about kind of at the very start of the podcast here. And so with Sharia, the difference between that and you also were mentioning with Polynesian culture, for example, and it's because if other cultures might celebrate a holiday sort of thing, and with Sharia, the instantiation of other forms of law, especially ones that tie in a religious element to it, which then means that you choose as what people would need to believe as part of it, and that's not, and that's even just a part of it. Also, the various rules within Sharia itself can be problematic. Of course, there's also a lot of definitions of Sharia, like you can, a lot of Muslims just see it as, the code by which they live their life, similar to how we're the Ten Commandments seem all right. Anyways, and then the last thing that I was saying was that I have noticed that since the Arab Spring, things have actually started to change with this in the Arab Muslim world as well. They've started to broadly, a lot of people that I've talked to, and there is some sampling bias there, but I've even talked to people in Egypt and Jordan that have said, maybe they're kind of going through their own piece of Westphalia sort of thing now, and that they kind of are sort of fighting for a separation between religion and state, and arguably a really unfortunate byproduct of that, in my opinion, sort of was part of the rise of ISIS. Those are the ones who are no, what we want is just a straight up Islamic state, and it's anyway, so those are sort of my last sort of few points from what you were saying before.
Okay, right. So I think one thing I want to get to is talk about what kind of border policies should we pursue generally, and then maybe within the specific context of countries like Canada, countries like the United States. Because I think, ultimately we can look at the problems, and we should probably then try to think of solutions after we look at them. Do you have any idea about what a desirable border policy is we'll just start with Canada and the U.S.?
Sorry, do you mean between on the Canada and U.S. border, or do you mean desirable border policies broadly for Canada and for the U.S.?
I would say both. I think with an eye to their shared border, but I think also with an eye to the borders they don't share with each other. Yeah,
sure. Also, that's another thing I should have acknowledged earlier, and you touched on this. Canada is so uniquely geographically and politically positioned, because you're right. We only have one border, and it's with a country which is not at an economic disparity from us, and with a fairly similar, culture. There's some differences, but So I recognize that Canada is not necessarily generalizable to other places, but I think that we can look at the Canadian-U.S. border as a bit of a, well, in some ways a model of what we can try to aspire to, because in some ways it is a, it's actually sort of the best border in some ways. It's the, for a long time it held the title of world's, longest unprotected border. And even, the amount of protection that we have there now and stuff is just, guns and stuff, which is it's not a huge deal. I think, sorry, so getting back to your question, I mean, there's a lot involved in that question, because we need to talk about immigration, refugees, safe third country agreement, and then of course the U.S.-Canadian border in terms of the changes that have occurred as far as rules around it go. I think that in the last 20 years, in my opinion, has been going in sort of the wrong direction slightly. It hasn't gone far in the wrong direction, but I do think that the end state, that eventually borders are not going to look the way they do worldwide, and I think that the Canadian-U.S. border's relative porousness is probably going to be closer, hopefully, to where most places will get to. In terms of where to start as far as specifics go, I would say that one of the big problems I'm seeing is a reluctance to say, hey, these are the rules that exist within our society, and if you want to be here, we are happy to welcome you, and if you don't come. It's that last bit has not historically existed much in Canada. We now have one politician saying that, and he's saying like, and when you're in Canada, you will be Canadian first, and he's taken some flack for that, but I think it's actually a pretty good stance. Like ideally it would be like, hey, we're going to be human first, but no politician ever, is saying that. So that's a ridiculous standard to hold someone to. So starting with the position of be Canadian first, and this is what it means to be Canadian, and the same for American, even though that says like, hey, if you're like, these practices are actually, kind of incompatible with what we consider to be Canadian culture. So that's, and the same would apply to America. So that would be sort of where I would start with that.
Yeah, well, I think I can sort of point to an even more ideal border situation, and that is what we see with the 50 United States. I think it's probably similar with Canada and its provinces, but I mean, I don't need to do anything to go from North Carolina to Virginia, from Virginia to Kentucky, from Kentucky to Ohio, and so on. I can go freely across the country. So you could think of the United States as simply being a cluster of 50 countries who have agreed to open borders with each other. And part of why that works is because, well, it's similar to why the U.S.-Canada border has worked in the way that it is. It's because the states can have enough similarity and interchangeability in their people, in their culture, in their ways, that it doesn't result in friction. And what we see with that is, I mean, it's a lot of what we've seen with the opening of borders among European countries in the EU. It's just a lot of costs, a lot of advantages in scale that come economically are now introduced. And I think if this is true within a region like the United States or like Europe, it would probably also be true globally. The issue is, what are you, when you go beyond a region, which can have internal similarities more easily than all regions of the world together, what are you stepping into? So we've talked about that. We've talked about things like Sharia versions of Islam. And we've talked about even if we go outside of that and something more near to the U.S., the instability within Mexico and within much of Latin America with the drug lords, with the human trafficking operations that are going on, with a lot of the political corruption and poverty in general. And so it seems to me that open borders are great, but it does assume kind of an even playing field between the two territories who are sharing a border and making them open. And if you don't have that, then open borders don't work. I think just given the state of the world, that's currently the case. I mean, much of the world isn't even industrialized yet. That creates issues with borders if you were to open them, at least too much. I think there's another issue too with open borders is and trying to okay. So this has often been discussed in the IDW, which is, and particularly by Jordan Peterson. This is often discussed in the IDW, which is the Pareto effect, where, and the Pareto effect describes, it's often been used to describe what happens economically, where 80% of the wealth or assets ends up in the hands of 20% of the population, while the bottom 80% has the remaining 20% of the wealth and assets. And we see that that's true of a lot of mathematical systems to some degree. It may not always perfectly be 80-20, but we see it, it might be 85-15 or 75-25, right? So, but sort of anchored around an 80-20 distribution. And of course, this was seen also with, not only with land distribution in Italy by Pareto, but with what pea plant produced the most peas. Mm-hmm. So this is a general mathematical function that can occur in any mathematical system, be it in an economy or be it a mini ecosystem like a pea garden. And I think it's also true of probably not only the economies of the world and the whole global economy, but also the cultures of the world, the nations of the world, the populations of the world, insofar as when we open our borders a lot, I mean, a lot of the people I think that we're mainly going to be getting will be the people who have the easiest time getting here. And that will either be the people who are right next to us, which is Mexico and Canada. And if it's not them, then it's the people who have the easiest time getting here. And even right now, with our somewhat closed borders, that's the case. And so I think what we're seeing is, with the whole just come to America, is we suck away a lot of the talent from other countries, and this depresses their ability to get better and become modernized and reach certain standards, not only of prosperity and like nutrition and access to electricity and the internet and education, but also in their ability basically to become something like America. Mm-hmm. And if I think part of the arrogance in the current wisdom, we'll say, about America being a nation of immigrants, let's just keep letting people in, is we're doing so because we do so only because only we can do that. If you're not American, you can't be like America. I think that's some of the conceit there. I think that's some of the implicit conceit that liberals either don't want to admit or are not realizing. And I think just in the long term, when we talk about the well-being of human beings globally, that is something with which we have to contend. What happens when a lot of our doctors are from India, and now they're not in India, and India's best doctors aren't there helping the people of India. What does that mean? I think there are problems that come with that, where we're kind of the 20% with the 80% compared to other countries, and a lot of that is a consequence of how we handle immigration and how open or closed our borders are. And I think we would see more of that occur if we did open our borders more. I mean, obviously, a lot of folks in Mexico who come here they'd be coming here more as something more akin to refugees if they aren't refugees, right? They're not highly demanded doctors coming from India, right? Some of them are just, they're manual laborers who are trying to make a living for their families. Mm-hmm. So that wouldn't be the case, but it would nonetheless be depriving Mexico as a nation of labor that it probably needs to develop its economy. I mean, because if the argument liberals often make about why we should bring immigrants into this country is, well, they provide useful labor that helps us grow. Well, if they're providing us useful labor that helps us grow, that means it's coming at the expense of Mexico, and it's only exacerbating Mexico's problem. And I think while there's an ideal end state where people from Mexico can relatively easily come to the United States and live here if they want to, I don't think it's tenable that basically everyone just has to leave Mexico and come to America, and Mexico becomes an empty swath of land. I just don't think that's ideal. I don't think that's fair to Mexico as a nation, and I don't think that would actually be particularly efficient. But that's sort of, I feel, the implication with the way we imagine, well, let's just let more people in. I think what we really need to do is not so much talk about border policy, but talk about what is our global plan to grow economies everywhere. Because I just don't, I don't think we're saying that. I think that is key. I think when we talk about letting people into America, we're not getting at the root of the problem. The root of the problem isn't that they're not in America. The root of the problem is that life is hard.
Yes.
And
I agree with.
We can bring people here, but that doesn't stop life being hard elsewhere. And populations are growing at much faster rates in the countries that people are trying to get out of when they come to a place like America or a place like Canada. And so you're just going to have an expanding number of people who are living under these suboptimal conditions, sometimes inhumane conditions, and at a faster rate than we could migrate them here. So that's the real problem we need to solve. And I think that would be an easier problem to solve. I think, as much as we want to be a land to everyone, there are the physical limitations. There's only so much space. There's only so much infrastructure. There's only so much wealth at any given moment. Economies can grow, and we can create new wealth. That is something that is often forgotten when conservatives think about economic planning. They think that the amount you put in and get out is always the same. They think of it like an accountant. But it does take some time for new wealth to be created. And so an open border policy where you could suddenly have people coming in could potentially be faster than an economy could grow to handle it. But even if it couldn't, there's the economies of the other countries, the well-being of the people in those other countries that's being overlooked. And I think when you look at the history of Western imperialism and colonialism, I don't think essentially forcing the hand of a lot of these ex-colonies or places that have been, we'll say, had quasi-colonial treatment, especially if you look at the way the U.S. has treated much of Latin America in the last century.
Yeah.
That's necessarily a solution or even justice. And so I think we really need to look at that. So, I sort of think about maybe successful examples of developing other countries. When we look at the Marshall Plan in especially as it was implemented in Western Europe and Japan after
Yeah.
World War II. Well, look at Western Europe and Japan today. They're alongside the U.S. in their standard of living. And in some ways, they do better. They do better sometimes on life expectancy or general happiness. Especially Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan were, demolished by the war.
Mm-hmm.
And Japan hadn't even entered as quite as an industrial society. And yet, look at Japan now. It's leading in global
the
technology.
Model for it's often used as the model for developing East Asian nations, actually.
Right, and so, this can be done in other countries. Of course, it helped that we occupied these countries for a while and therefore controlled how this money was spent. Aid packages to other countries where it is then used at the discretion of the sovereign entity can be problematic because there can be corruption within the regimes that receive these funds, and that's rather often what happens. I mean, if you look at most of the aid that ends up going to struggling sub-Saharan African countries is just squandered by the corrupt leaders who get a hold of it. That's why a lot of it is just. That's why a lot of what we try to do through like the UN and what's the body called that tries to deal with economic development? It's like ECOSOC or something.
Yeah.
A lot of that's just kind of been a bust because of that, and because of these internal problems. And so we need to look at, well, what can we do to address those? And what can we do to make it so that immigrating to America isn't necessary? I think that's, while immigration should be, in a grand scheme, be possible in just so that individuals have the freedom to experience the world, just as I have the freedom to experience California like I do North Carolina. Right? We don't want immigration to be a Band-Aid on a gushing wound.
Yes, I agree with that very much.
And I think that's sort of what we're looking at here. I think that's what people aren't discussing. And so I think border policy really needs to lead us to discussing that realistically. And I think we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater for the things we discussed before. Just because, terrorist groups could really make use of an open border with Mexico, and the human traffickers would make use of it if we truly said, let's just make it open and not that, and let people walk right in. Because there are, to my utter surprise, there are Democrats asking for that now. It's not huge yet. Like a lot of, I know conservatives think that's like the mainstream platform of the Democratic Party. It isn't, but I will say that it's gaining traction.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, and because the way liberals have thought about it, it really goes no further than, oh, why shouldn't we let people in? I'm not racist. Let them all in, right? And that's as far as they think about it. But they don't think about why borders exist in the first place. And there are a lot of good reasons.
But I would actually say that it's, I would say that in some ways conservatives sort of do something similar from a different angle is what I've noticed a little bit. If I can kind of jump in here. You sort of raised a lot of points in the last little while here. It's going to be hard to get to all of them. Interestingly, I mostly actually agree with your conclusions. There was a few premises that I was not down with, so I'm going to start from the beginning of that last section there. I actually love your thinking about the states within the USA as a more ideal border. I actually often think about that, and I just don't always use that. I don't usually use that example because a lot of people don't necessarily see it that way. But I think that it's a perfectly legitimate example. During the Cold War, at one point, Stalin wanted each each Soviet republic of the USSR to have a seat at the UN, and your president at the time, I forget which one it was, said like, okay, if you're going to do that, then each state of the USA, gets a seat as well. Come at us, bro, basically. And I think that was, legitimate, actually. Like, that's, if they want to go that route, it would have been just as legitimate, in a lot of ways for the states to have responded that way. So yes, it assumes an even playing field, and which is why, yeah, my whole position on this is that we should, we should look at, how can we level the playing field so that we could, eventually live in a world which, doesn't need hard borders. Like that's, yeah. So which I think it sounds like you're also saying there. And I also agree with the point that immigration, itself only actually, kind of it puts a Band-Aid on a gaping wound sort of thing, and that's usually sometimes. There's also like, there's an element of opportunism there, which I think is, noble, frankly. Like, in terms of, well, not noble, but I think that it's certainly, one should be able to say like, oh, hey, I can make the most opportunity of my life, in this particular spot, which is why I think also there's a bit of a flaw in the premise about, if there was an open border with Mexico, that all of, everyone in Mexico would just want to, not, again, I'm not saying that there should be an open border with Mexico, because there shouldn't be, largely due to, I would actually say largely due to economic reasons. Like, you don't want to just completely destabilize, the entire economy kind of thing. I think that's pretty fair. But I don't think you would get every Mexican coming to the U.S. if they could. It's a bit of a slippery slope fallacy there. I also think that as, populations shifted, there would be more opportunities, in Mexico's, like, oh, suddenly all the land is becoming cheaper and stuff here. Well, I can make use of that. Someone's going to think, so those are a few points on there. But yeah, so that actually is my, and with the Pareto effect, I'm at least somewhat trained in quality improvement. It's one of the roles I do at the clinic that I work at, and the Pareto distribution is actually a major component of that. Like, typically in quality improvement, we often say that 80% of the problems, can be solved with 20% of the solutions. And so yeah, I often will create a Pareto chart, which is just the one that just kind of has the cumulative, distribution line going up, to along with the x-axis, like categories, kind of saying, and with the y-axis being, percent of the problems, and it'll, yeah, then we pick the ones, so getting back to it though, yeah, I think that in order for us to move towards, leveling a playing field, we need to be able to say, these are the things that this country does right, and these are the things that this country kind of does wrong. And we, especially on the left, do not want to do that. It seems like, yeah.
Yeah, and I think probably another thing to do is, in addition to that, I think where countries don't have much reason to show these self-off from, well, okay, I'll go into what I was discussing in our previous episode together, where I talked about the end state for human beings should be, in my view, a global democratic state.
Yeah.
And if we spread to other planets, it should be interstellar democratic state. But for now, we'll focus on Earth. And I think we're seeing some of the groundwork for that already. I think the EU is sort of, in a way, gravitating toward that, whether it realizes it or not. Probably, I don't think it really does realize that. I think they were mostly focused on European issues, but I think in the grand scheme, it will come to be seen as something that got us toward a global democratic state. I think the main nations that could increasingly integrate with little issue and therefore enjoy a certain openness in their borders with each other are, of course, the EU nations, and then probably also the United States and Canada. I think they could move to some kind of union that's similar to what we see among the European member states in the EU or among the 50 United States in our system. I think something like that is very practical. It would not be hard to implement. It would just sort of have to really, we'd have to shake up these fictitious ideas that were too disconnected and unrelatable. Like how divergent are America and Canada and, say, France and Poland? I mean, probably not that much. Right? They have their differing.
It's a huge issue. I agree with you on that one. There's a lot of people who would say, I am a red-blooded Canadian. I'm nothing to do with America.
And you could even maybe as a second wave extend that to other first world countries. So you could expand this union to probably Australia, New Zealand, Japan with less ease for the obvious reasons, not being an Anglophonic nation. So doesn't quite exist under some of the legal traditions of the West in the same way. And then there are the cultural things. But I think one thing we have seen, particularly with our generation, is a great amount of dialogue between Japan and the West. I mean, Japanese technology is huge. Their video games are huge here. I mean, anime is such a big part of Western culture now. It's no longer just a Japanese phenomenon. It's a big part of Western culture now. And I think that shows that there's a homogeneity that's occurring between Japan and the West that would I think gives hints that such inclusion of Japan in this kind of union would be relatively simple compared to, say, Iran. Right? And so I think what such a union could do is, one, it would sort of set a model example for a global society, particularly because, especially after the second wave, it would span multiple continents. Well, the first one it would, but it would span more than just the two. It would, spread into the two major oceans, basically. And then what it would do is it would allow these nations to consolidate their geopolitical capital, we'll say, to be more impactful in the underdeveloped and non or less democratic areas of the world.
I don't need to put you on the spot here, but given what you're saying there, I have to wonder, were you pro Trans-Pacific Partnership?
I was actually against TPP.
Right. Which makes sense. I think most people kind of were, especially most Americans. How do you square those two thoughts then? And I'm not saying that like it makes sense, but I'm just like,
I think my explanation for this is pretty simple, because there was language in TPP that would have allowed corporations to ignore national regulations that could be argued to impede their business prospects. That, to me, was the nail in the coffin as far as why someone like me wouldn't support it. Because fundamentally, what you're saying is, Well, okay, so like with the EU, a lot of people in we'll say the UK, right? Since Brexit happened, a lot of the concern was that they were losing their sovereignty to this other political entity that was European and not British. Right? What you were seeing with TPP was effectively, in a manner of speaking, a loss of sovereignty to something that isn't even a political entity, to something that is even less democratic than the EU is said to be. And the EU is still generally a democratic system. A lot of people get fixated on the Commission, which doesn't consist of democratically elected people, but the EU Parliament was still democratically elected, and the Council, of course, consisted of democratically elected heads of state. And then, I mean, you have to be a democracy to be in the EU. They don't let dictatorships in, or they don't let low functioning democracies into the EU. They have standards like that. So I think TPP had features that really undermine the ability of democratic nations to govern themselves and protect them from what these multinational corporations might do. And I think this would have had economically disastrous effects in how it would have probably been harmful either to consumers, but also in particular to laborers. If you think of something like NAFTA as being bad for labor, I think TPP would have had a lot of those same problems, and it would have amplified what has been an endemic problem, at least as the United States is concerned, with how workers are being displaced, and what that does to our consumer base, and how that makes goods and services in the American economy increasingly illiquid, which then can lead to a stall when there's a shock to the economy, and therefore an economic crash like we saw in 2008. And NAFTA had some good attributes, just like in that it eliminated some costs and created some new efficiencies, but these efficiencies weren't really able to spill over into new growth as they should have been. I mean, a lot of the gains of NAFTA basically just went to the wealth, and they're just kind of sitting on it and not really investing it or developing it. And you don't want money to pile up at the top, right? This is why the Pareto effect, when we talk about how it's bad for immigration, we don't want all the good people just to go to one country, and then everywhere else in the world just sort of becomes a wild west of struggle. Now that's an extreme example, but that's sort of, the immigration, as often discussed, kind of gravitates toward that when it shouldn't. And then you could say a similar thing economically, is that when we have too much wealth that amasses at the top, that's just bad for the way trade works. You need some circulation, right? If the heart was pumping your blood, and over time all your blood just went to your brain, the rest of your body would die, and then the brain would die. And that's basically why we saw what we did in the Great Depression and the Great Recession. It's just, the system requires all the nodes to have some activity, and the bottom has to support the top. If you cut the legs off, the top falls down. And there's this blindness on the political right about that, where you can just keep inflating the top and somehow it's better. But if you don't also enrich the bottom, then you get too top heavy and you have a collapse, or what some economists like to call a correction. And so that's why I was against TPP, because it was bad economics, but also just the political implications that corporations could ignore what governments, democratically elected governments, might try to pass to regulate. And to me, that's just, again, if you believe in democracy, you can't believe in that stipulation in TPP, right? Like I'm for a global democratic state. I'm not for global harmony that is non-democratic. And if TPP is fundamentally non-democratic in that it can allow multinational corporations to just say fuck you to what laws from government by the people decide, then I can't support that.
Mm-hmm. I actually agree with you on this, but but a friend of mine is he's a big fan of libertarianism, and you actually, I get him to listen to these podcasts. And so he would probably argue, well, something along the lines of corporations, consist of people. And so by limiting those corporations, you are limiting those people, and you are infringing on their freedom. So he would probably ask, how can you consider that to be an infringement? Like, if the people that the corporations consist of are there's a freedom argument here, I suppose. How do you respond to those? I'm not great actually at responding to him along the lines of.
Okay, so I think I think often what libertarians get caught up in, not all libertarians get caught up in this, but many of them do, is that they don't understand that while certain levels of economic inequality are acceptable and in many ways inevitable, I mean, if I make a painting and you give me $500 and we both had the same amount of money, well, now I have $500 more than you, right? Now we did a trade, it was fair, but you just have a painting, right? You can't really do anything with it. You might like it, right? So, inequalities, even in a moment, occur, as well as over time. And so I think there's this misconception that freedom is only, there's too much focus on freedom insofar as it concerns things like wealth and your ability to do anything, no matter what it means for other people. And I think for us to be generally free, there are certain things that have to be equal. So political equality is a very important thing. So now some of us might be more efficient. Some of us might be more productive. Some of us might be more rational and moral. But it is still very useful that one person, one vote is the principle by which democracy operates. Just because all human beings, while they might not be equal in their capabilities, seem to have pretty equal or very comparable ability to suffer.
Yes.
And I think that's relevant. And I think what we're often talking about when we want freedom is our ability to escape suffering and pursue pleasure and not get caught up in that. Now, what we see, so what political regulations seek to do is basically say, well, we're going to set some consistent ground rules so that these common causes of suffering don't happen, right? Now, if Jeff Bezos wants to make extra money, I don't blame him for that. But if his freedom to make extra money results in the needless suffering of thousands or even millions of people, possibly even their premature deaths, which at the aggregate could be the result, then I'm not worried about Jeff Bezos' freedom, because it seems to me it's coming at the expense of other people's freedoms. This doesn't mean that the accruing wealth is bad, because again, there is some merit to capitalism and a meritocratic economic system. Therefore, right? Communism would not work because you don't have the incentives in place. But if the incentive systems become more important than what they're trying to realize, which is the freedom and well-being of other people, if Amazon's need to grow is more important than the people that it ultimately provides service to, then we're losing sight of what the real big picture is. And I think that's the only real response I can give to the libertarian point of view. But I think it's pretty solid. You can't get so caught up in the mechanisms, which can on the face be free, and not think about what their overall consequences are, and be incurious about them or callous to them. And the long-term grand scheme effects are why we choose the systems that we do. There's a reason. Like, democracy isn't intrinsically good. We use it because it best enables us to escape the kind of suffering that can happen when you consolidate power under too few people or just one person. And there's a similar thing with capitalism. The reason why we do it is because it's not just better. It's not like it's just better to let people do what they want, because you could let people do what they want and they could then just do horrible things. But within an economic system, it does allow some incentives for people to do what is productive and feel like they have a stake in adding value to the economy and therefore creating wealth for all of society. But if it gets to the point where that wealth enjoyment only really is being seen in the hands of a few, that destabilizes the economic system. This is why there's a concept of capitalism and a separate concept of late stage capitalism. The idea that a capitalism sufficiently undermining itself over time reaches a state where it doesn't have any of the obvious benefits that it did at first, right? So if you think of capitalism in America in the 50s, you compare it to capitalism in America today, you're looking at, in many ways, two very different economic realities. I mean, capitalism was the envy of the world in the 50s, but there are a lot of problems it has today that it didn't have then. And
I would interject that there's a lot of problems just in general today that didn't exist, in the 50s. And I don't, you would need to make the argument to me that they are unique to capitalism, because that's something that I definitely disagree with, well, I suppose with more sort of Marxist, economic theories about, is like, I think this narrow view of looking at capitalism today as it was then, but only ever looking, like, it seems like people will be okay with sometimes looking at capitalism in context when it serves them, but not looking at the rest of the world in context while they do so.
Okay, so I think one good indicator that we'll say American capitalism is like the problems that we're seeing, particularly socioeconomic ones, can be tied to that system. Is if you look at countries that are also capitalist but have the guts to put in public systems or regulations where needed, you're not quite seeing as much of a problem, right? So everyone who's progressive likes to talk about the Scandinavian system.
Yeah.
And they're right, but there's a reason that they do, because they have a very successful economic system. They're capitalists, so they're entrepreneurs, they're innovators, they're rich people, and there's a way to reward hard work and success there, and to empower the people who are able to produce, and then when they produce, there's excess for other people to enjoy. And there's not the issue of, say, wealth piling at the top and hurting the ability of circulation to occur, and therefore the amount of trade that's going on, right? There are public programs that have some redistributive efforts that keep that from happening without totally going full Marxist. And so there's, those are the advantages. Now, what conservative libertarian types often say is like, well, these are small homogeneous countries, so it's easier to do. Well, that just isn't true. Okay, so especially if you're talking about a public program, something that's going to be nationwide, your advantages and savings would get better with scale.
Yeah, the scalability argument for me does not really hold any water. There are small, prosperous, homogeneous nations, and there are large, prosperous, homogeneous nations and stuff. And there are there's actually a lot. I have a lot of problems with a lot of issues with the scalability arguments. I also think that, like, I sometimes hear the scalability argument when it comes to healthcare in the States, and you guys have the perfect system, like, because each state of the United States has, you know, has such rights, it has such sort of, not independence, you know, sort of a bit more sovereignty than, say, like provinces in Canada have. You guys have the perfect system to, you know, to start a, you know, a universal healthcare system from one state and roll it out, you know, state by state as they see that it's, you know, successful, sort of thing. So the scalability argument is essentially just it's just one, it's a slightly veiled, slippery slope. It's like, oh, well, it would be difficult to do, therefore we shouldn't do it, basically. It's like, no. Slow down there. I agree with you on that point, certainly.
Right, and you know, and the scalability argument is why, I mean, if you accept what it is that makes corporations so able to innovate in the ways that they do, because, I mean, I'm okay, I can complain a lot about corporations, but I can acknowledge that there are things that they can do very well that the mom and pop shop just can't do, because the mom and pop shop doesn't have scale on its side. And so if you accept that about companies getting bigger and bigger, you have to accept that the same general mathematical principles apply for public systems as you increase the scale. And so we can look at a lot of the Scandinavian models and just simply say, well, we'd be operating at larger scale, so we'd be able to capitalize more on the efficiencies that come from that. I mean, even as small as the Scandinavian nations are, there's enough scale for their systems to work.
Yeah.
And so you can only assume as you go up from there that it gets better, right? There is a critical point in size as you go down where it doesn't work. Like, obviously, you couldn't have...
I think that an argument probably could be made for population density as well. That one, there might be upper limits of population density, which some nations in the world might be close to, that can interfere with things.
So that's probably true as well, because...
yeah, but the U.S. doesn't really need to worry about that. They will need to worry about that for a long time. Yeah.
That's probably true as well. But I think probably in general, there probably might not be too much of an issue of population density with the Earth, because it does seem to be that once a nation reaches a certain level of modernization, birth rates level out.
That's true. There is that as well.
And so I mean, we're seeing that with Europe, for example. And we're seeing that with, well, so, I mean, basically the Americans of European descent in the United States, largely. And so, you know, it's most of the population growth in America is from immigration. And then where there are new births, it's from, like, Hispanics and Asians, I believe.
It's pretty similar in Canada as well. We are below replacement as far as birth rate goes, and so population growth is stimulated by immigration here, and it's mostly our immigrants to Canada which are producing larger numbers than the native born population.
And so when I look at the Scandinavian model, right, you see something that basically it has all the necessary parts that makes capitalism work, but it doesn't. It's aware of the holes in the system at the aggregate and seeks to plug them up as best it can. And I think the best the conservatives could say, or the best critique they could say, is that the Scandinavian countries are relatively resource rich, and that assists in how they do a lot of things. So this isn't true for all of them, right? So Norway has pretty good access to oil in the North Sea. Sweden doesn't, though. And, you know, Finland doesn't have this quite either. And so, you know, that's not something they're banking on, but things like that help. At the same time, though, the United States is a very resource-rich nation.
Very.
And, you know, we might seem like a bigger nation population-wise, but we're also bigger land-wise. And for the most part, the western half of the country is just open terrain with resources that can be used. And even still, much of the eastern half, there's plenty of resources to use. Like,
And Canada is that to an even larger degree. Not that that's particularly relevant.
We don't have too much arid territory, and we're in a pretty temperate climate. There's we have a lot we can do, and then we of course have trade capabilities on that for both major oceans. So yeah. I mean, it's good to be the United States, right? And the idea that like we don't have those advantages, and then of course most of the world's wealth, well, not a majority, but we are the wealthiest nation in the world. So there's the greatest concentration of wealth in this country of the global economy than anywhere else. I think it's like 30% of the global wealth is in America. I think that's the calculation. What makes it so that we can't afford a healthcare for all? And then here's the other thing, right? Again, just going by capitalist logic, right? You're not trying to improve livelihoods by making everyone equal necessarily. You're trying to improve livelihoods by creating new wealth. When you cover everyone's medical issues, they stay healthier longer, and they can work for longer periods of their lives, right? So aging is less consequential if the health problems that come with aging can be tackled. But then this is true of health issues also where age isn't necessarily a factor, right? If you remove barriers like health issues that keep people from being productive in the economy, then that's value you can now put into the economy through labor, through creative work, through innovation, by these people who otherwise would not be able to do it or would do it in a more limited capacity. And there was a study done in Europe where they took these workers. I wish I could remember more specifics, but basically for every I believe, euro they put into providing healthcare, medical treatment for these workers, they got about 3.73 more euros back in added productivity. All right, and that is something that can only happen when you realize, okay, you can't leave everything to a purely capitalist system. Some public programs can cut costs and create inefficiencies, especially because public programs can operate with scale in a way that a mom and pop shop can't, and in a way that even a corporation can't, right? Because the best scale is to have basically a government monopoly over a good or service. And you want to be careful about doing that because you don't want to crush efficiency. So that then gets you to the question of what's an efficiency of a privatized insurance system? And as far as I can tell, privatized insurance systems don't offer more efficiencies or innovations over that of a public system, because that's just pooling money and then issuing payments out whenever it's relevant. But in a manner of speaking, that's just banking, and it doesn't really. We're not going to get a better insurance system in 10 or 20 years. We're going to get better automobiles in 10 and 20 years. Okay, we're going to get better computers in 10 and 20 years. These are things where innovation is actually key. You could even say we're going to get better restaurants in 10 and 20 years because you can learn how to make new recipes that maybe taste better or taste in different ways, or at least have a different atmosphere that people can enjoy. We might be able to develop food more cheaply. We might be able to develop healthier food. We might be able to develop food or produce food more quickly so that it's more lucrative to spend your time going to a restaurant getting food rather than cooking it yourself, right? These are innovations that can apply to almost any other industry. But you can't say that about insurance. It's always put some money in, take some out. And money as just a unit of trade isn't changing. It's pretty much the same as it was 100 years ago. Some people might argue, well, we were on the gold standard 100 years ago, but that whatever differences that meant are and were minuscule.
I'll push back for the sake of argument there, even though I actually agree with you there, but I would say that it depends on what you mean by better when it comes to insurance. And because our data science is improving really quickly right now, your risk prediction, ability, which is, I would say, a large part of what insurance is, probably will see some improvements in some way, although those improvements will also come with some major, problems as well, though. Like,
Well, I could think of one right off the bat, like, oh, you're too risky, we won't cover you.
yeah, you're
I
like,
mean, so
yeah,
where
you're
those
like,
improvements come,
that's
it's
shitty.
useful to their bottom line, not
Yeah,
to the bottom line of consumers. They'll happily take your premium, and then they
yeah,
just won't give you the payment out, which is like basically stealing. So it's good for their bottom line, but it's not good for ours as consumers. And that's the issue. Is it can only really get better for them. It's not going to get better. Like the actual product we get isn't going to get better, except independently in what doctors and hospitals manage to improve. But that's not talking about the payment system, right? So a payment system is something that you can, I think, monopolize publicly. You don't lose a lot of the advantages of efficiency and innovation that come from private competition, because they just kind of aren't there in the first place to be lost. So you might as well just cut the glut, cut the share of your premium and copay and deductible that goes to the CEO, and just have it go straight to your medical service. Cut the excessive, the MRI tests that you didn't need, but just get the one that you did need. And my father was an MRI tech, and he could tell you all the time they would order MRI tests, which are expensive, for parts of the body that were probably just fine. And based on the symptoms, you could usually tell what part of the body needed to be scanned first. And then if you didn't catch the problem, just order another, right? I mean, I remember in that debate Ted Cruz had with Bernie in 2017 about healthcare on CNN, talked about how we get like 3 to 4 times as many MRIs as these other countries you're talking about. And it's like, well, Ted, I happen to know that we don't need that many. So we're just pissing money away that could be spent on other things. So yes, you've done an excellent argument of why we just have a woefully inefficient system, and why these Scandinavian countries can basically get the same result and better, covering everyone, while spending 50 to 25% less per capita. And that's, I mean, these are things that come about, and so we got a long way from immigration and borders and
right. I'm kind of enjoying this conversation, actually,
but
even though I think
I do think, but these are some of the advantages we would get at scale with a new country, and these are the advantages at scale that occur when you open borders and allow more trade and intercourse between human populations. And I think that's part of why America has been successful among its 50 states, and I think that's why the EU has had some successes. There were some mechanical errors in the way the euro was implemented, but the barriers to trade that would have otherwise been lifted by the EU, being what the EU is, are undeniable. And they happened in spite of the failure of the euro. Like, a lot of people look at the euro crisis at the start of the decade and say, oh, this is proof that integration doesn't work. Well, the euro was just one thing that didn't go right. And if they had simply phased in to a single currency rather than lumped all of these divergent economies into a single currency at once, it would have been easier. Of course, we can't go back and change that. So we have the single currency, and we have the EU that's expanded as much as it has, and we just need to tweak the things that are wrong. But for the most part, the EU has been an economic boon. It's allowed labor to be allocated to different countries among the member states more effectively, and it's allowed capital to flow among the countries differently. Again, if you're a capitalist, what do you have against the flow of capital more freely, right? It's just flow of capital should not come at the expense of the freedoms and dignities that come with democracy.
So what happens when there's a contradiction there? Then I'm thinking specifically about the bailouts, following the following the economic
the 2008 crash.
Yeah.
Are you talking about the bank bailouts?
Yeah.
So how are
You're
you?
saying how, um, the capitalism doesn't work when it's, incongruent with success in a bigger picture sense. But if we're not, incentivizing corporations to behave by bailing them out, then doesn't that, conflict with that idea?
So you're saying that the bank bailouts basically motivated the banks, possibly other industries, to say, well,
If we can get to the point of being too big to fail, then we're off scot-free. So let's
yes.
all just do that.
So that's an issue, and I think a lot of that explains why there's so much frustration in America right now. Because I think a lot of 2016 and all the anger that was in that election, some of it, was a positive anger that found its way toward the Bernie Sanders campaign, but some of it was also more negative anger that found its way toward the Trump campaign.
I agree with that.
I think a lot of it is the residual angst and suffering that occurred from the 2008 recession, and then seeing the bank bailouts happen. And the banksters got a bailout, and then many of them took a bonus. But when your house was lost, right, and you had to move back in with your parents at the age of 40 with your kids, you didn't get a bailout.
Yeah.
I imagine that burns. You go in, you bust your ass every day, and that's what happens. Democrats and Republicans pass that bailout. Now, the arguments for passing the bailout, at least to just stop a complete collapse, made sense. Like I can't deny that. If the flow of capital would have just completely collapsed if we'd let the big banks fail, it would have been an even bigger disaster than the Great Depression if that had happened. There was so much to collapse, and that's why it was too big to fail. And so the real issue was, how do we prevent that from happening again? And how do we maybe punish people who did it to set an example? And then culturally, you could say, there are regulations we could put in to prevent it happening again, but then there are examples that could be made so that there's a culture of fear against doing something bad. We didn't do either of those things, really. I mean, there was the Dodd-Frank Act, but that was a pittance compared to Glass-Steagall. We needed to keep the banks from consolidating too much like that, and we needed to prevent the phony lending and consolidation of toxic assets with, more attractive assets that you would put on the top of the stack to be seen, right? From that, we needed to stop that from happening. We needed to stop the shadow bank system from happening. And we haven't really done a whole lot to keep those things from recurring. And then, of course, again, we needed to stop those things from being so bad that if they went bad, that they are likely to result in a rupture. And they were likely to result in a rupture because, again, too much wealth had gravitated to the top. There wasn't enough purchasing power by the American people, such that when you have something like a housing crisis, people don't have the household finances to deal with the ripple effect. All right, and so I don't think there's so much of a contradiction when you talk about something that's too big to fail. I think if you're talking about the advantages of scale, I think the problem there.
Example, the Prime Minister bailed out the auto sector, which is maybe is a bit more, maybe that might be more salient because it's like, well, there's the idea that it's, good that he stops, that he prevented, working class people from losing their jobs. But yeah, the libertarians would say, like, and he and Ben Shapiro actually had a conversation about this that was really fascinating, especially for me, who, like, for me as someone in the left who doesn't really agree with necessarily either of them, although I'm also Like I need to do more. I need to get more education as far as economics go. Like I think there is a contradiction there between, you know, whether we say, hey, do we place people first all the time, or do we say like, well, if in the long run that might incentivize people to grow their businesses or corporations in such a way that they can reach a place of sort of immunity, then that's a problem. That doesn't.
Okay,
like,
I look at it like this. Say you have 3 kids. One of your kids wanders in the road without looking, and then a car is about to hit them. Now you can push the kid out of the way and save them, or maybe pull them so you're not accidentally throwing yourself in front of the car. We'll say pull. Or you can let him get hit, as an example to the other kids not to run in the road before not looking. All right? I myself would just say pull him out of the way and then address it in some other way that teaches the lesson without the kid getting hit by a car. And
that's
I think
a great answer.
You know, I think people have looked at the bailouts with that same thing. Well, we should have just let it all. You know, we should have let the banks suffer for their mistakes. But the thing is, an economic system implies so much interconnectedness that the failure of the big banks would have been a failure for everyone. I mean, the flow of capital would have ground to a halt. People's retirements would have evaporated, things they'd spent their whole lives developing. You would have seen mass homelessness, mass starvation, just because suddenly there's no value in the economy like before, and people don't know what to do with their money. It would have been a humanitarian disaster in some parts of this country. And some parts of this country arguably already experience humanitarian disasters. It's just daily life. Look at Flint, Michigan and its water crisis. I mean, you know, is that the kind of, like, look at post-Katrina New Orleans when the Great Recession happens. I mean, some things are bad enough and you just want to crank that up. Not you, but, you know, the general you. And so, you know, I think that's the issue there is there can be nuance. Like, we like the intellectual dark web for instance. There can be nuance to something like this where you say, okay, we're not going to let you, we will save you and not let you die just because you being alive is useful to us, but you're going to pay for putting us through the trouble of saving you. And this is going to, you know, make it so we don't have to save you or others at least as much in the future. And I think that's the way we need to look at things. And I think the bailouts had to happen, right? And I think they provide us sort of a cautionary tale for like what's happening with automation, right? Like Democrats and Republicans, probably not as many Republicans, I don't remember the numbers, but they bailed out the auto industry too here.
Right.
So the bailing out the banks was to save the flow of capital. Bailing out the auto industry was to save a great number of jobs and therefore a great number of incomes that businesses depend on. Right? Businesses depend on people having income so they can go and buy their products. And so if you look at a massive loss of jobs there and say, okay, we got to stop this. And now we're looking at automation, probably within the next 10 years, going to get rid of 7 million driving and cashier jobs. You have to think, what am I going to do to prevent this loss of income and the impact it will have on the economy? If you're
and trucker jobs, I think is, or sorry, did you mention driving, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, right.
And the thing is, while cashier jobs aren't great, trucker jobs tend to pay well. And so you're not only just going to be losing a lot of jobs, but a lot of jobs that give pretty decent purchasing power. And I shudder to think what the impact of that will be. I
had a realization with that the other way, and I realized we're also getting pretty long for time, so we should wrap it up soon.
Yeah, so
I had all along those lines, like I've actually always been, you know, I was one of those people who was always sort of for increasing the minimum wage, and maybe but then I realized, like, wait a second, if we're losing all of these jobs and a lot of them are minimum wage, then minimum wage increases very soon are not going to solve the problem, like at all. There's just going to be like, well, all these people are still don't have jobs. Like minimum wage increases, and it might actually.
there's going to need to be a multi-pronged approach to maintaining the purchasing power of the citizenry, just so a fairly normal capitalist system can actually function.
Yeah.
And conservatives and libertarians can learn that the easy way or the hard way.
I think a lot of them are actually starting to get on board with that. In fact, some of them even have proposed like a what's the alternative? There was sort of an alternative to a UBI, negative income tax, I guess. I haven't decided which whether it or UBI is better, but it does seem like they're starting to get on board. But yeah, the realizing that about the minimum wage stuff was a wake up call for me. Anyways, yeah. So
yeah, so you are right that we're getting a little short on time. So I think I'll give it to you to sort of just lead us out, sum up your thoughts, sum up some of the key points, and maybe just leave some ideas for people to consider about where we can go on something like open borders, and then and what these human integration projects, as I see them, can do for us.
Yeah, I think you and I had 2 points of agreement. There are sort of 2 points of contact as far as the immigration stuff goes. We both recognize that the current state of of nation states and borders are not how it's always been, and by extension, probably not what you refer to as the end state of humanity. And so the question is largely how do we most efficiently get to the end state of humanity, rather than like in terms of and I agree with you also that it probably should be a global democratic state, and I like your idea of eventually an interstellar democratic state. I can. There are arguments that people might make in terms of why that should not be the case, and I feel like maybe we didn't address those here, but perhaps future guests can do that, because the role of culture itself, whether, and actually our relationship to the past, how much we want to hang on to it, is something that could be considered. Okay, so we agreed with with the origins and with the eventual end state, and so I think we sort of seem to disagree on how we go about creating a leveled environment. But mind you, we need to have these sort of discussions in order to, in order to process that question. We can't, we can't just come up with an answer without knowing what the variables are, which is also why I introduced the libertarian arguments, which I mostly disagree with. There are bits of libertarian arguments I do agree with, like I mentioned, even with the minimum wage thing. It's like, well, very soon, the whole minimum wage thing is going to seem like an irrelevant, point. If unemployment is really high, the minimum wage for those who are employed is, especially when minimum wage might decrease, employment rates, because it would be more expensive to employ people potentially. I'll leave it to future guests and perhaps make that argument as well. And lastly, I would just like to sort of thank you for sort of letting me just work through these ideas, because unlike my first podcast here, where it was stuff that I've ended up thinking about the social constructionism and its implications and how it plays out in life a lot, versus this stuff is still rather new. And because, like so many things, it can be so charged, I often don't end up really having these long for that. I think I'll pretty much leave it there. I really also liked your points just recently about the did you pull the kid away from the car, or do you say, well, the car's a lesson? I certainly am done with that. I also think I screwed up I shouldn't have included the piece about homogeneity in my argument about scalability, because I might put my foot in my mouth there. But anyways, so mostly, thank you for letting me have this conversation.
Well, and I thank you too. I think while I think it's been the current tendency for people to come in with a topic and really enlighten us on it. Um, I don't think that's all that this podcast has to be, and it sort of gives us a ground for us to think out loud,
Yeah.
and ponder some of these questions and some of the bigger issues that we're not really able to do within mainstream media because people want to beat their sound bites and talking points into their voting bases and not think critically about the issues. And this is true of Democrats and Republicans, even though I myself am a pretty active Democrat. That's a criticism I can't help but honestly make about my party. So I thank you for coming here and helping with that on this issue. And if you ever want to be a guest again, let me know, and I'd be happy to have you again for part 3. I'll probably try and get some new guests and some other people for a part 2 before I do that. But as always, Eric, it's been a thrill to have you on.
Hey, thanks a bunch, Joe. It's been an absolute delight to be here. So
all right, well, I'll catch you in the sub, okay?
sounds good.